impacts, what I noted is the mean average temperature in India increased by zero point 0.7 degrees Celsius for the past century. And also we started noticing the changes in precipitation patterns. And also there is a significant increase in the frequency and the extreme weather events of late. And these are the three main observations that I noted in the report. And the projected impacts, mostly the one that we have observed, the same will remain even in the projected impacts, but the intensity and the frequency of these events will be very high, as you can see here. In fact, the mean temperature would probably raise from 1.8 degree to 4.4 degrees Celsius by the end of 21st century. And also they clearly outlined that there will be a significant impact even on the agriculture in India. And this is pretty much about the observed and the projected impacts. And the next slide talks about the adaptation policies. The content, I have taken it from the report, Impacts, Adaptation and Vulnerability Report. And some of the adaptation actions called out in that report are water management. I'm not going to read out each and every sentence. I'm just going to highlight the main actions. The first one being water management, disaster risk reduction, the agriculture, the health, and the infrastructure. These are the main adaptation actions called out in the report. And when it comes to the mitigation actions, I have taken these actions again from the report, Mitigation of Climate Change. And some of them are renewable energy, energy efficiency, low carbon transportation, and sustainable land use. And I've also put out a snapshot of some of the sources or the types of renewable energies that we currently have. As you can see, solar, biomass, hydro energy, so on and so forth. And continuing the mitigation actions, we also have carbon capture and storage methodology and how it works. I put out a picture which shows that right from the source, these products try to capture the carbon dioxide and try to compress it, transport it, storage, and utilization. And finally, the carbon policies, that is basically carbon pricing and emission cap and trade systems. And finally, the R&D regarding with respect to climate change mitigation actions. I think that's pretty much have in my slide. I've just taken the first stab at the report. I am not sure what Abha wants at what detail level Abha is looking at. I've just tried to keep it as simple as possible and try to cover as many points as possible in 3 to 4 slides.
No, I think this is good. See, the thing is, whatever relevant, the thing is, depending on which field you're working in. So what the effort that you've made is really great, I must say. And you've sort of tried to make it, you made good use of infographics. You've taken out data, pertinent data, able to identify, India specific, that is good. That can be done. So the basic objective to give this case study was you should know from where to cull out data, how to tap into the resources. Now see whether depending on which field you come from, so your area of interest as far as data and resources are concerned, somebody working on, say, suppose carbon markets will have different interests, somebody working on clean energy will have different interests. So the basic objective was you should know your way to navigate, pick up the data of your choice, your relevance, and then sort of use it in your work. So I think it's a very good effort, Vinay. And there is no end as far as IPCC data is concerned. There is no end to the depths up to which you can go. So I wanted a crisp, precise, short presentation. So this is good.
Thanks. And one more thing, just to follow up on the comment that you made. I work in financial industry. So for us, it's not just one industry that we are looking at. All the sectors we look into it because banks finances every industry, right? Every sectors. What I noticed is IPCC predominantly or completely only captures the physical risk aspect of the climate change. Do they even capture the transition risk aspect of the climate change?
Not as of now. Not as of now. They are working
Mm,
on just transition aspects, but that is, it is in the evolution stage. Just because just transition as a concept in itself is in the evolution, because now that push for net zero and then to transition out of, or like what was the controversy was there last time, phase down of fossil fuel and then scaling up on the renewable energy or clean energy efforts. So the transition you make from a fossil based economy to a economy that works on clean energy system, that is evolving right now. Now, as the thrust for net zero is more, that is how the need for just transition is evolving. So maybe as of now, they've not addressed up to AR6, they've not addressed, but they are definitely going to address it in the 7th assessment cycle. So as of now, as far as IPCC is concerned, this area is still untouched by them, but the work is going to start because just transition is picking up. So
okay.
at the UN level, I can tell you they have a sustainability hub, sustainable energy hub, SEH, on which they are working on various aspects of energy, including the concept of just transition. And in India, Jharkhand is the first state that has constituted a task force on just transition, because primarily its economy is primarily coal driven. Jharkhand and
Mhm.
that entire Chota Nagpur mining belt. So you have the economies, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, primarily dependent on coal mining. And when we talk of net zero, so then we are phasing down fossil fuels. So how that economy, the structure of the economy is going to change. So the government is actually concerned. So last year, November only, they've constituted a task force. In fact, the UNDP India country office is collaborating with them, supporting the task force in carrying out various assessments, projections, basically that how the economy is going to change. And if the economy, as and when it changes, then the manpower which is basically engaged in the fossil fuel industry, then they need to be reskilled so that they fit into the new economic structure. So just transition is basically, it belongs both to the mitigation and adaptation aspects, because mitigation, because your entire energy mix-up is going to change, and adaptation because you have to reskill the entire workforce. So it is picking up. So maybe IPCC cannot stay aloof with a very major development. So maybe the next assessment cycle we might something published on covered on this by IPCC also.
Yeah, because these two are closely related and I mean, to be more precise, inversely related, right?
Yes.
If the transition risk is very high in the present world, then the physical risk at the later stage will be considerably low, and vice versa.
Yeah, true. So we have any more presentations, or shall we start? We are about 7:18 right now. Pratiksha?
Yeah, we can start about.
Okay, and so if we have any more presentations, we can take it up in the end. And I've added one more slide on your request about data usage in our daily work. See, the thing that I find is that the participants who introduced themselves, most of you are working under the ESG space, so ESG. So I've sort of tried to capture how you can gather the data, because I am myself, Pratiksha is the expert on ESG, not me. So I come mainly from the climate science point of view, but what all data you can access that can be used in your ESG reporting, or otherwise for any industry for reporting, and also for, transitioning to net zero in terms of what all you can cull out of IPC. So I've sort of added one slide onto that. So shall I start, Pratiksha?
Yes, yes, yes.
So are you able to see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, so I just a short recap of what we did yesterday. We had basically started with the basic structure of IPCC and what is the governance aspect of it, the working groups, the task force on inventory, then how does the entire members, and they have a plenary and it functions, and how do the assessment cycles work. And we basically, the look that we had at the reports, we basically browsed we could only browse the interactive atlas for the first working group. But the thing is that essence, in a nutshell, it is like IPCC every 4 to 5 years brings out a huge assessment report which tries to cover the climate science aspects, the mitigation aspects, and the adaptation aspects. And as far as the climate science aspect is concerned, the first working group, physical science basis, that relies heavily on climate modeling because it works on the concept of climate scenarios and climate projections. So observation based data, they have data which is observation based, and then they depending on what is going to be the policy mix and how individual governments are going to act on their climate action, they develop various scenarios, and those scenarios, when they feed into climate models, they give you certain projections. And depending on those projections, what are going to be the future climate impacts it brings out. And then in that particular scenario, it also gives you a spread of mitigation and adaptation strategies. Now, it is two things I want to reiterate again. IPCC does not do its own research. It only collates the research that has been already published in peer-reviewed scientific journals. That is one. Second thing is they make policy recommendations. So they don't make policy prescriptions. So the spread is right there in front of you. And just because of the nature of international negotiations, it is not prescriptive. Okay. And then the thing is, there are a lot of complex variables that the reports they deal with. So most of the reports, and especially the AR6 assessment report, sixth assessment report, for which the synthesis report has just come out last month, they have made an interactive atlas. So you can just go around. So the atlas try to navigate your way. You can otherwise go to the reports also. But what I suggest is, depending on your area of work in which you're working, your field of your domain of working, you can selectively first pick up the data, generate that data from the interactive atlas, and then maybe look for more further elaborations in the text. Then we also went through few terminologies and key concepts which basically pertain to climate modeling only, because mitigation adaptation otherwise is it is also quite a big field. So I have not sort of touched upon various things, but you would have seen in the presentation that Vinay made in the beginning that, there's a huge spread that is available. At your own time, you can browse. Now, today what we're going to cover is more on the, not on the we are not going to go inside the reports. We are going to go around the reports this time. So I'm going to cover the implications and applications. How can you use these IPCC reports in policies and business, in your social setting, for education and research? So one big segment would be this. Then there have been certain critiques. It is not that IPCC reports are there. It is huge data bank in terms of knowledge, climate science and its implications, but it is not an untouchable structure, IPCC in itself. There have been a lot of critiques, but basically what it says is not gospel truth. So there are a lot of critiques that are that a lot of critical analysis or critiques have been passed on IPCC per se as an organization, also on their reports. Then IPCC, as a response to those critiques, has improved a bit. So I will cover what have been the big critiques, major critiques, how IPCC has responded and improve, for that matter. What have been the debates surrounding the IPCC process and their reports. And I'll highlight one controversy, which was a major controversy related to the IPCC report, and what the controversy was, basically pertaining to Indian region only. And then I'll sum up the session for today, maybe add up what we did tomorrow also. I intend to I intend to have a discussion in the evening where I'll be open to questions, any doubts you have, because we had only 2 days and it was a very brief workshop that we had 2 days. So it is not possible to cover almost everything for a big knowledge sort of resource we have available in terms of IPCC reports. So there's a lot that can be explored. So anything that you have, any query that you have related to IPCC reports, or generally anything, any topics that we touched upon, some other thing you want to add up as far as climate change, climate science is concerned, you can pitch your questions. So I'll be happy to sort of address them. And now let us start with what we have in the mix today. So I will cover the implications and applications of IPCC reports. So the first thing is, let me make that distinction. So implication is when you have an indirect or a secondary effect on something. So if you have an IPCC report or any product, its methodology, assessment, supplementary material, whatever. So not direct use, but indirectly, if something comes out, then how it has affected its surrounding, its environment or other processes. That is the implication. Application is where you can use that resource and use it directly. So application is your first-hand direct usage of the reports. You can call out data and how you can use it in different ways. Implication is how it has in a secondary manner resulted in other sort of nudge that has resulted in other things. So the way IPCC reports, the implications have been, first thing is over the years, right from the first assessment report to the latest report that we have, and from the last assessment report, from the 6th to the 7th assessment report, first thing is the IPCC reports has been able to, as far as the physical science basis is concerned, IPCC has been able to pack a lot into their pathways, the ones that have been used to give you projections, because till about fifth IPCC report, most of it was on the biological or geological or physical processes that take place in the atmosphere. So most of it was science-based, physical science-based. From fifth and more so in the sixth assessment, when they have graduated onto the use of shared socioeconomic pathways, they have been able to pack a lot of social economic parameters into it. So in some ways, they have been able to sort of go beyond the climate science and try to integrate many other aspects which influence, which are sort of relevant to climate action. So so in some way, it has been able to sort of give you an urgency for action, because it has clear evidence on the impacts of anthropogenic climate change. Anthropogenic means human induced. So in a way, it has implied, or it has emphasized, the urgent needs for immediate climate action. And with climate, though the visibility of the sixth assessment report, if we compare it with other maybe non-science related, not climate science related things, you'll find the visibility is not as much as it deserves. But still, with the use of various outreach efforts, with the statements that have been brought out by the UN chief and other intergovernmental bodies, it has sort of brought that urgency of climate action into the fore. That is one. Second thing is, it has always played a role in climate policy guidance, whether it is at international level, national level, or local level, because it has highlighted, it has a scientific basis which highlights the potential for climate change impact across different sectors. So it plays a very major role in the policy guidance. So at national level, international level, it suggests the policy options for mitigation and adaptation, depending on whether it's projections, various scenarios, and how these, depending on what your priorities are. But it's one of the biggest implication is policy guidance. If you have a assessment report which gives you a huge spread, and it highlights that there is the climate action needs to be urgent, then it also gives you a spread of the policy guideline that needs to be there. That's one thing. Okay. Now the next thing is, it has built scientific consensus. And if you remember yesterday's presentation, the opening sentence in this summary for policymakers was that there is unequivocal evidence that climate change impacts are anthropogenic. So the degree of scientific consensus, if there's I haven't shared that graph, I should have shared that graph, but from the time the first assessment report had been published, from there onwards, the number of publications and basically it's a proxy used for the amount of research that is going on. The amount of research that is going on in understanding the impacts of climate change over various environmental, social, and economic aspects, and the interrelationships, that research has increased many folds. So initially, when the type of scientific literature that IPCC was handling was about 1,000 in thousands, now you have about more than 10,000, tens of thousands of literature that IPCC peer reviews. So the more published research you have a much broader sort of set of evidence to say, okay, this is the published, it is a peer-reviewed journal, it says, so the evidence is more. So one of the implications has been that it has built the scientific consensus. You still have a set of climate skepticals. It's a normal distribution. You'll always have some set of science, but otherwise it has been able to build a lot of scientific consensus. And then that has also informed to some degree on the public understanding and decision making on climate change. So people are more aware. If you compare with, maybe just compare with about 10 years or 20 years back, how aware we were about the climate change and the human impact on climate change, or whether we should be doing about something, or the advocacy how much advocacy do we need to know. But if you talk to people now, then you have still you find that the degree of awareness people have about, people understand what is, when the COP is there, then there's this huge there's a rise in that, the social media visibility also. Otherwise, international community, national community, local communities, people know that there's a COP going on and this is what they're talking about. And so people know, the youth is more aware. That is another factor, that with the increased awareness, there is also an element of eco anxiety that is building up amongst the youth, that okay, climate change is so urgent and the action required is so urgent, but why that much effort has not been put. But the thing is, the public understanding per se has increased on climate change and its impact and the reasons, what are the reasons because of which the urgent climate action is required. And a lot of credibility for that goes to IPCC and the type of reports that is generated, because it has collated the entire data, bits and pieces, mein region wise, yahan ye ho raha, yahan wo ho raha, but it has collated the entire thing and it gives you area wise, region wise, how climate change is going to impact which area. So the credit about building public awareness and providing a sound scientific base to it, that credit goes to IPCC. Then it provides you societal impacts, it has implementation, because then now you have an authentic platform which tells you what are going to be the impacts of climate change on societies and on environment. So initially it used to be, it has also evolved, the process also evolved, but initially it was more science focused. Now it is more sustainability focused. So they talk not only about the climate science per se, they also talk about the environment, its impacts on economies, its impact on societies, and then what are the also makes the recommendation. It also highlights that the impacts are disproportionate in the sense that climate change impact, you again go into the IPCC reports and see that where the vulnerabilities are high. So you find that the impacts are more over some regions, and why the impacts are more, one reason can be that the incidences of climate events are more extreme there. That is one. Another reason can be the population of that particular region. It is a low income country or it is a developing country. So they have lower capabilities, they have higher vulnerabilities. So that disparity that exists within the society, that has also been highlighted. And the third thing is it informs efforts to build resilience. So the social impacts are also well taken care of by, and it has evolved. It was not so in the initially, but with IPCC reports, it has come up. Then another thing is that it is a UN body formed under, not exactly a UN body, you can say, but formed by under the aegis of two UN bodies, the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations Environment Program. So it's a recognized international body, which has the onus to come up with scientific evidence for international cooperation also. So most of the time you'll find that when major agreements on climate change or major negotiations on climate change take place, then IPCC is the body which is responsible for providing the scientific knowledge. So it provides a shared knowledge base for international cooperation on climate change. If you see which are the major outputs which had been, or IPCC outputs which have contributed to climate change negotiations, so you'll find that the first assessment report which came out in 1990 basically gave a sound base to UNFCCC. This is not 192, it is 1992, my error. So when the first global convention came up on climate change, which is known as the Rio Convention or UNFCCC, so the sounding for that, the scientific base for that was provided by the first assessment report. When the Paris Agreement, so many years after, about almost 20 years after UNFCCC, 2015, when we had the Paris Agreement, so the scientific grounding to that was provided by the fifth assessment report. And in post 2015 world, we are in the era of sustainable development goals. If you see how the development goals have come up, so you'll find just around the millennia, 2000, the millennia started, 2001, the MDGs or the Millennium Development Goals were adopted, the UN adopted it. So there were 8 goals. Then, and we made a plan for the global community under the aegis of United Nations, made a plan that over a period of 15 years, from 2001 to 2015, these are the 8 areas or the 8 MDGs over which we are going to work. So there were a lot of indicators, and read the text on, or you might be knowing the MDGs. So they were on health, education, cooperation, not exclusively on climate change, but a major chunk on climate, also on environment, pollution. Then over the period of 15 years from 2001 to 2015, our own understanding on the science of climate change improved. What are the various factors, how it cross-cuts that improved. So then 2015, Paris Agreement was a major milestone as far as climate negotiations was concerned. But otherwise, in terms of sustainability, we adopted the 17 SDGs or the Sustainable Development Goals. So from 2001, we had MDGs, 8 MDGs. 2015, we had 17 SDGs. So from Millennium Development Goal, we graduated onto sustainable development goals. It's not only development goal, it is sustainable development goal. And when you talk of sustainability, you know, it's always an overlap of your environment, social, and your economic aspects. And from the SDGs within the Paris Agreement, I covered yesterday also that there's a process of global stocktake, which takes place in between the period of 5 years period of the submission of nationally determined contribution. So to guide that process of global stocktake, there are a lot of special reports that the Paris Agreement asked the IPCC to prepare. So I covered it yesterday, special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius, that special report on climate change, on ocean, cryosphere and climate change, and another third one on climate change and land. And along with that, the sixth assessment report, which has just come out, whether from 2001 to 2021 to 2023, all the 3 working reports, and then the synthesis report. So all these reports are now going to guide the global stocktake process of 2023. So the thing is, international cooperation which body leads the science on climate change? It is the IPCC. So these are the implications. Now, what are the applications? So if you look at it, I will cover it briefly because it becomes not very technical, so it's very easy to understand. In policy development, whether it is international policy, whether it is national policy or subnational policy, the IPCC reports, they provide a scientific basis. They also give you, they help you in identify the policy options. So they give you a spread of options, and through their modeling exercise, they even give you an option to evaluate the effectiveness of the policy, because you have those scenarios. So if you see that if India decides to go, I give you India specific examples because of the fact that we are working within India. So if you find that, okay, if you go for a very stringent GHG trajectory, low emission scenario, then how it is going to translate? In that case, what is going to be the cost if I go, because GHG emission, everything is interrelated. So your industry is going to change, your economy is going to change, accordingly your environment is going to change, your social parameters, because social aspects also feed into your SSPs. So, and then you find that, okay, if I start with this type of scenario, 30 years down the line, 40 years down the line, I'm going to reach this goal, but at what cost? So it also gives you an option to evaluate the effectiveness of your policy, because it will give you a projection with a certain scenario. So all that flexibility, that is an application that you can use. You can apply using the IPCC reports. It also gives you risk assessment. Now, risk in itself is a very huge field. Vinay also mentioned now, and he comes from the maybe more soundly grounded on economics. So I would not be able to comment more on that, but it gives you the IPCC assessments, they give you sector specific risk. So say suppose you have in the health sector, how human health is going to get affected by your, say suppose, heat stress, or with your precipitation patterns, or with your temperature patterns, how your availability of water resources, and then your water stress, then its impact on agriculture, then its impact on economy. So basically it gives you sector specific risk. And then depending on your risk assessment, it can help you prioritize. You in the sense, it can be your government, it can be your business, it can be your whether depending on what is your area of work. So it can help you prioritize action, and also to allocate resources depending on the vulnerabilities. Say suppose you are in industry which is working on one particular sector, then what are they going to be the impacts of, or what is the risk going to be on various supply chain, how it is going to affect your economics. So you can basically do a risk assessment, realize how vulnerable you are, and accordingly allocate resources to prioritize your action. What else can it help you with? It can help you with decision making, in sector specific decision making. So if you come from energy, not how it matters, it depends on what are the specific inputs we are going to use, what are the scenarios you're going to use. It is going to be industry specific, sector specific. So whether you're working in the industry sector, energy sector, industry, agriculture, forest, water, infrastructure, health, waste, so various sectors. So specific decision making depending on the sector that you're working. Your business planning and design, what I covered earlier also, you will evaluate risk. On basis of that, you'll do your resource management. You will evaluate the type of technologies that you're going to make. In technologies you're going to use, you're also going to make your base your investment decisions depending on the future risk that is envisaged to your particular business. So the resources that are available, they can be used for your planning and design. And then you can design, if you're a policymaker, then mitigation, adaptation strategy. If you're a business, then accordingly your future strategies for investment and based on the sectoral impacts and the type of path you want to take. Say, suppose your industry, you want to become net zero in so many years. So how do you reduce the carbon footprint of your supply chain? And ESG mein to khair, there's a very detailed methodology, so I'll not go into that. But broadly, depending on your sector, what are the strategies you're going to use? The data that is and the outputs which are available in these reports, you can utilize them. Next one is on research and development. Research has got huge. In fact, if you look at the citations, IPCC citations, I think I've read a paper somewhere, that paper that analyzed that how many citations do you get in research papers on IPCC reports. So you will hardly find a paper which is working in any domain that touches climate change, and hardly find any which does not mention a IPCC, which does not cite IPCC as a reference. So its use in research and development is huge. The type of resources that it has available, so it provides valuable resources for researchers and scientists. It also helps you identify knowledge gaps. So the knowledge gaps are the area where more research can be done, and which can later on inform the future research. So suppose it says, suppose you're talking of gender. Let me just take an example of gender. So some aspects it has addressed, I'll cover it later on the critiques and the responses. So they found that gender is a knowledge gap area. So a lot of research, because it brought out a lot of research, future research on what are the nexus between gender and livelihood and climate change. So those social aspects were that research, a little bit of research started doing that. In our national communications, I can tell you, till about our last reporting on second biennial update report, there was no chapter on gender. But then IPCC had identified it as a knowledge gap area, and that was incorporated into the national reporting requirement. The developing country parties were encouraged to report on it. So then it becomes, it came into your foray. Okay, now you also have to conduct some research on the interaction between gender and climate change. Or then you find, obviously, gender basically is as climate change. Gender is also very cross-cutting. If any field you see, gender ka cross-cutting aspect is always there. So basically, it informs in terms of what are the resources available, what are the knowledge gaps, and then it can be used to inform future research and development effort. For education purposes.
Excuse me, yeah. Ma'am, what do you mean by cross-cutting?
Cross-cutting in the sense that, say, suppose, let me give you an example. Say, suppose I say we are talking about energy sector. So energy sector may, if we are talking of net zero, or we're talking about nationally determined contribution, so then you say, okay, if India has now made a commitment to go net zero by 2070, then this is the type of energy mix I should be having. So I should phase down fossil fuels, and I should sort of increase the share of clean energy sources. Very simple. Mathematically, I'm just putting it simply. It's not that simple. Then if you go by, these are going to be our solar energy targets, and India should have 500 gigawatts by 2030, and whatever commitments you make. Now, if you are going to make that change in energy mix, then you have to see how the fossil fuel industry is engaged, and if you phase down fossil fuel, how the workforce which is involved in that industry will change. So you'll find that primarily in the mining industry, you'll find it as male. But if the mining industry ke saath, the tertiary industry that are managed, there's a lot of women participation in the workforce. So gender comes in. Then if you look at how it is going to impact livelihood, so you'll find that if you have to retrain them, then people who are engaged in fossil fuel industry, but the same people cannot be used on the renewable energy sector, because first thing is their skill is different. Second thing is RE sector requires a much more grounding on your STEM subjects, even for the basic handling. तो जो माइनिंग कर रहा है आज, कल उसको तुम रीस्किल करके आरई इंडस्ट्री में नहीं लगा सकते. Why? Because वो उसका तो कुछ साइंस का बैकग्राउंड ही नहीं है. if you have to sort of train them on usage of, say, sort of solar photovoltaic, or say operation of windmill, so you need to equip them with certain training, technical training. Now, when you look into, and there are people who are working generally from non-metro cities, people from rural areas, if you see the penetration of science subjects or STEM education, you'll find that gender again comes into it. So there are some aspects, if you try analyzing, there are some aspects which get reflected into every domain. They are called cross-cutting. So like climate change, you see agriculture, you'll find impacts of climate change. You see energy, you see waste, you see industry, you see business, you see forest. So you'll find that climate change impacts almost everything under the sun. So we say climate change is a cross-cutting issue. Similarly, you find gender is also a cross-cutting issue. So I'll not go more into gender for two reasons. First thing, I have a very working knowledge on the gender aspect. Gender is a specialization itself. And second thing is, just by the virtue that half of your population, if you divide gender wise, and the disparity exists, you look into the pay structure, you'll find there's a disparity in the pay structure of, women working at the same level, male working at the same level. Not in terms of, you talk in terms of CEO and higher management, no, they'll be paid more or less the same, but how much is the woman participation there? So if you look at the higher management, you always find a glass ceiling. You look at the lower area, you'll find that women are more into caregiving
Yeah,
roles.
got it.
So getting it, I might diverge if I start about gender.
Yeah, that's what.
So cross-cutting basically is something which cuts across all the domains. That is cross-cutting. Okay. So you go into public education. Where was I? I was on, so IPCC resource in public education, using the applications of IPCC products in public education. So it is a key source of information on climate change for the general public, that is known, and that can, the resource that it can be used to inform and also to educate on the science, on impacts, and on mitigation and adaptation. So other than, first thing is that you use those reports in your operational aspects. You use those reports in your policy aspects. You can also use those reports for journal awareness building. It can be in the research community, which is actually higher levels of education. So research and development, but it is already there because it's a complex thing. But then to sort of deconstruct it and incorporate it into public education also, it can also act as a sound resource. Okay. Then political influence, there have been certain, I'll now come on to the critiques. So there have been, IPCC has had its own share of critiques. So it's not that IPCC is there, you take it as a gospel truth ki IPCC hai, le lo, kisi ne kuch kaha nahi. So the critique has been that it is under the reports that come out are not, they have a certain bias, political bias or political influence. How does it manifest itself? That the member governments, say suppose, just to give you an example, before 2014, we had Congress government. 2014 onwards, at the national level, we have a BJP governed, BJP controlled national government. And if you see in terms of the visible commitment, I'm using the word visible very critically, visible commitments to climate action, to climate justice, you'll find the entire international narrative has changed post 2015. So you have now our Prime Minister going and making an announcement, India will go carbon neutral by 20, we'll go net zero by 2070, or we are going to enhance our renewable energy targets, or we are taking a higher commitment on the energy efficiency of GDP. And they say we acknowledge that the developed world is responsible for the problem, but we being a developing country still are keen to be a part of the solution. So you find this type of narrative changes. What is this? That is difference in, it's a sort of political mandate of the government from a member country. You're getting my point? So India's, now the thing is, if you have a very visible political leadership, national leadership at the international platform that is able to influence policy, that is going to influence the process. So the classic example is that when you had a Trump administration coming in, they withdrew from the Paris Agreement. So there was a lot of pressure on now with US going out now, because US also being a very huge funding partner to the United Nations. So, the entire geopolitics it was shaken. Now with the Biden administration coming in, you had them rejoining. But then what are the political interests of the member governments that influences our international process in which geopolitics is always at play? So IPCC has also been criticized that at times they have sort of underestimated or overestimated the severity of climate change. The classic example is the Middle East. So you have a collaboration of Middle East countries, which are basically oil producing countries, and they have a strong influence on the type of international negotiations that go on. In fact, the last this COP, कहाँ पे था? Egypt, na?
Egypt.
Egypt, Sharm el
Yeah.
Sheikh. Yeah.
Yes, it's Egypt.
Sharm el Sheikh.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
Sharm el Sheikh, India was the type of statement that came out, or not the statement, the decision, to be technically correct, the decision that came out was supposedly the negotiations were around the world on phasing out of fossil fuel. Now, India as a country today cannot afford to phase out of, if you look at the energy mix, are about 67% or 70%, the energy mix, the share is coal based. So if you say coal based, where is the 70% of energy is going to come from? So India cannot afford to be on the phase out. So India negotiated and negotiated around the terminology, and we could bring it to from phase out to phase down. And the oil producing countries were also not in favor of phase out. So phase down came in. Now the international community got too agitated by it, say India and all those people, all these countries, they are sort of anti-climate action and all those things. But the thing is, you have to be grounded onto the realities of your own national interests. So what I'm trying to tell you is that, and at times it affects the critique for IPCC per se was that based on the political influence of some countries, they have either underestimated some impacts or overestimated the severity of climate impact. So this has been a critique of IPCC. Then the next critique is that they over-rely on climate models. Now, because that climate models are not perfect. Climate models are based on assumptions. Another thing is the type of data that gets fed into climate models. There are also data gaps that exist. Suppose you look at African region. There is not much historical data that is available for African region. There is not much historical data that is available for areas which are uninhabited. So if you have some observatory, say in the Arctic region or in the Antarctic region, wahan ka data is available, but there's some regions which are not manned, so wahan ki data is not available. Now, if that area is, now what you do is you generate proxy data for that particular region. So if you're using a proxy data, that there's going to be uncertainty. Now, if you have an inbuilt uncertainty in the data that is being fed into the model, the output will also have uncertainty or will have a certain bias. And you're relying, see the IPCC reports per se, if you look at the physical science basis, primarily on climate projections. It gives you, this is how the weather is going to be, how the climate is going to be. So if you rely something, some heavy reliance on climate models, which themselves are not perfect. So what they say, one of the critique has been that there's over-reliance on the climate models. And because there are uncertainties, so there's failure to consider full range of possible outcomes because you have uncertainty inbuilt. So that has been another critique. Another critique has been that they have a very conservative approach as far as they give out the impacts of climate change. So if you see, I'll not say how much of the critique is correct or not, but in response to these critiques, they have taken some response measure, which I'll now cover after this. But then initially, when they were saying there's little confidence, their medium level confidence. So IPCC also has gradually sort of increased its level of confidence level. So that has been a acquisition or a critique of IPCC, that they have downplayed the severity of climate impacts because it has been established in 1988, a huge scientific body with a lot of resources going in. They're producing big reports, but they had not been so vocal about, they had downplayed the severity of climate impacts. But another thing is that even now, with a very advanced IPCC report, AR6 is one of the latest reports which has taken up sort of collated data from research on the advances on climate science, but still how much climate action has been taken up or being driven. That is again a challenge. So if you have good science, that does not necessarily assure a very emphatic climate action. That is another thing. So that it has a conservative approach, that has been one of the critiques of IPCC. Another one is that its scope is limited. So initially, and that is true also to some extent, that initially it was basically grounded more on climate science. The social and the economic dimensions were not incorporated. And because of this, they were not able to sufficiently address issues like justice, like equity, like ethics. Because climate change is one thing. I will briefly touch upon it, because if you look at the UNFCCC framework, you find it is firmly based on the principle of CBDR and RC. CBDR and RC stands for common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities. I'll break it down. Common but differentiated responsibility. They said common hai, responsibility is common, but it is differentiated also. Why? Because if you look at the trajectory of development, you'll find that the global north, which is actually the Western developed world, they had started developing very early. So because they had started, the industrial revolution had sort of started there. So they started the industrial revolution, which was primarily coal based initially. So the amount of pollution and the emissions that they have added to the global stock of carbon emissions is their share is more. And then they were hired, they were, sort of wealthier economies, so they could develop much faster, had access to more developed also. R&D also has a contribution, but now they have access to much cleaner technologies. So now they've been able to arrest their emissions, and they are basically on the track to decrease their GHG emissions. But if you look at the quantum historically, how much they've emitted, they have emitted more. And because of those emissions, the climate impacts that are being manifested, the impacts are more on the global south or the developing and the least developed countries. Why? Because they're more vulnerable. So if you look at from a justice perspective, so the cause, the action was responsibility is common because it's a global world, climate is a public good, but their share to the problem was more than our share in the problem, but our share in the impacts is more and their share is less. So is it just? Now you cannot incorporate. IPCC has not addressed this problem of historical emissions. It has not been there a part. The debate is there, it exists internationally, but it has not been sort of factored into the IPCC reports. This CBDR and RC and historical emissions, historical responsibility, equity, ethics, these things are not addressed. So they say it's very limited. And these are valid questions. These are valid questions. Who has done more harm and who is bearing the brunt of the impact? It's an interesting topic for otherwise discussion. Another thing is lack of diversity. So the thing is that if you find that which are the voices which are historically dominating the IPCC, also per se, they have been developed country parties. So the more say has been of those developed country parties. And in terms of gender, in terms of ethnicity and geographical representation, you don't have much diversity in IPCC, because what happens is you have member countries. So member countries may you'll have one representative from one country, one focal point from one country. So how much diversity can you incorporate? Gender, ethnicity, and geography. So it has lack of diversity. These are the major critiques. What has been the responses? So what it has done is basically, I'll not go through everything. You can go through it in your own time. What it has tried to do is, first thing is it has tried to make its process more transparent. So what they've done is everything is sort of available on public portals. That is basically to everything. I'll not cover because it will take a lot of time to cover all this. Political influence, what they've done is expert review badha diya. Number of review, they have one first order reviews open to the entire globe. Anybody can register as a, depending on which field and showing your credentials, you can give your review comments on this thing. Then they've increased the rounds of peer review. So they have, first thing is expanded the scope of the review. They've increases the rounds of review. They have increased more consultations. So you have more participation from governments and other stakeholders, your observer organizations, and they've tried to improve the communication now too. So that is basically to sort of say that we are not under political influence. Our processes are very transparent. Now for over-reliance on models, what they have tried to do is they have tried to sort of improve the research on the climate models, the type of data and everything else that is used. They've tried to sort of more collaboration between the modelers and the researchers. So they've sort of tried to improve the accuracy of the model itself. And second thing, what they're doing is they're expanding the data sources. So the less uncertainty you have in the data set, the higher will be your accuracy. So they have sort of tried to, they have addressed it very well. That is still evolving. So like initially they were used to be RCP scenarios. Now they've graduated to SSP scenarios. So integrating other aspects into it. They're trying to sort of add on more observations. Then they're connecting the modeling community and the researching community so that you learn across the disciplines. So that is their work on this. On the conservative approach, what they have done is, conservative was you're not integrating your socio and economic aspects. So they have tried to improve their scenario analysis. And with the SSP integration, they have been able to achieve it. It is still in the evolving stage. It will maybe requires much more, but then they have been able to consider a wider range of scenarios. And just severity pe question tha pehle ki worst case scenarios ko you're not giving it more visibility, so they've been able to address it in that. So they give you extreme scenarios also. In terms of limited scope, what they've tried to done is they have increased the collaboration. So collaboration with research institutes, with scientific communities, with other governments, intergovernmental bodies, scientific bodies, universities, and so they've expanded. Then they started to try to integrate perspectives from other disciplines, social sciences, economics, and engineering. They've initiated special reports, like we covered, specific aspects. Ki agar 1.5 की warming होगी, so how it will impact. Specifically, ocean पे क्या impact होगा, cryosphere पे क्या होगा, land पे क्या होगा. So specific aspects they've initiated reports. And from the 5th assessment report onwards, what they've added a dedicated chapter on social, economic, and ethical concepts and methods. So they're trying to, whatever research is available, again, they don't do their own primary research. So whatever research is done on these things, social, economic, and ethical concepts and methods, so they've tried to collate that and sort of pitch it in as an independent chapter. So this has been their response to the critique. On lack of diversity, they formed a gender task force, and what they're trying to do is that within the author teams that they select, and even in the leadership positions, it is their endeavor to maintain a gender balance. And they are seeking more representation for developing countries, so experts from developing countries. And I can give you my own example from India, because the last project that I was working on, so our advisor was the IPCC focal point within the Ministry of Environment. So we used to nominate the experts for, and we did it for AR6 during that time, I remember, different working groups. So whatever the set of authors nominations that went from India, we had a gender lens, and we saw that if we have these many, and another thing is you need to have experts, women experts in that particular field also, that is also a thing. But we tried to balance, if we had the availability of women experts in that particular domain, it was an endeavor to sort of nominate women scientists also, domain experts from our country. So, and it also because now there's a huge thrust on inclusive and gender inclusive and more parity towards gender balance. And then it encourages, it is an initiative. So when they seek nominations, they encourage that you should nominate people who come from diverse backgrounds, indigenous people, local communities. So provided you have experts who belong to these particular communities, the IPCC encourages people, and it has improves its outreach and encouragement and engagement with the stakeholders. So basically it has taken more, what I covered here also, that more interaction from other civil society organizations, universities, and indigenous groups, and also basically the more inclusive you are, the more you address diversity. There have been certain debates have been, first thing is there has been scientific disagreement. So now this remains, and there have been questions on reliability and accuracy, and that they do not account for all the factors. Then again, what was the critique has been a debate also. They said there are a lot of political influence. They try to downplay. And one interesting debate has been around the economics versus environment, because what happens is now with the cost benefit analysis and these things coming in, usually what is done is that the spread of mitigation and adaptation actions that are given, they usually come with a cost. So IPCC will tell you that if you take up this mitigation scenario, then this is the type of cost that is going to come up. So the question is, the debate is that the cost of reducing the GHG emissions, if you become very stringent on mitigation, then you have to pay a very high cost, because you're using clean technology, you're using, you're phasing out, non-clean sources of energy and all. So the cost is going to be very high. So I think a right approach should be that you focus more on adaptation. So make it a balance of mitigation and adaptation. And the counter argument, this is from the economics community. The counter argument from the environment community is that if you don't take any action to mitigate climate GHG emissions now, then the loss and damage that will be incurred because of enhanced climate impacts, you'll eventually find that your climate inaction will bear a higher cost, just because you were at that time whether to go ahead with those mitigation strategies or not. So that was high. So your loss of climate inaction is going to be much higher. So there has always been a debate between whether you should go ahead with these particular mitigation policies, or how much mitigation, mix of mitigation adaptation should be there. That debate is still live. It stays.
Excuse me, ma'am.
Yeah.
Ma'am, I just have one question. So, adaptation and mitigation, they both are kind of have the same meaning, because and there are still like 2 different working groups and all that for that. There's working group 2 for adaptation, working group 3 for mitigation. So in adaptation, when I was going through that, going through the summary for policymakers, they say that, you know, for flood risk, you need to do this, that. And even mitigation, they also say the same. So what is kind of the difference between the two actually?
Okay, so let me introduce or maybe sort of restate 3 terms now. One is when you talk about climate change, one is mitigation, one is adaptation, and all of you who've been following the Sharman Sheikh debate, you'll find there's another term called loss and damage. Okay, I'll tell you what is the distinction between the 3. So I will try to pitch it as simply as possible. Not that it is simple, it is very complex, but just for giving you the concept. Okay, so you have climate change because of anthropogenic GHG emissions. Anthropogenic means human induced. Okay, so just because had humans been not there, had they not been sort of, you know, with their activities increasing the GHG emissions, this entire problem of wicked problem of climate change would not have been. The natural variability chalti rehti with seasons, little bit of variation, but with human induced activity, GHG emissions. So now let us keep the human induced separate. Let us now focus on GHG emissions. So the simple science says the higher GHG emissions you have, the higher temperature rise is going to be there. Okay. So I'm just putting it at a very basic level. Now, if your GHG emissions are going to increase, then your temperature is going to rise, and with various feedbacks, I will not go into the nitty-gritties, but high GHG emissions means higher heat retention, higher temperatures, and everything is going to go haywire, बढ़ जाएगा, सब कुछ temperature बढ़ जाएगा, all the impacts are going to increase. Now, how can you combat climate change? If you have to address climate change, you can do it 2 ways. First thing is, you have to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions. That is one starting point. So any action that you take to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions, that belongs to the domain of mitigation. So if I say reduce pollution, any measure to reduce pollution will be mitigation. So you say end of pipe emissions hata do, catalytic conductor laga do, or, you know, whatever it is, or maybe have a stringent policy, coal pe cess laga do. ये सब चीजें, ये सब mitigation है. Any action directly or indirectly that leads to reduction in greenhouse gas emission, cutting down of GHG emissions, is mitigation. Adaptation is climate change के impacts को cope करने के लिए. You have heavy precipitation. So just to give an example, let me give you another simple example, rainfall. So I have to reduce the rainfall at one particular place, just to look at rainfall. So I do some sort of cloud seeding to increase the rainfall, or maybe some sort of thing to reduce the rainfall, some action to reduce the rainfall. The action to reduce the rainfall will go towards mitigation. Lekin agar barish giri gayi, how do I protect myself from rain? So I take an umbrella. So umbrella becomes an adaptation measure. Got it. ठीक है, सो सी लेवल राइज है, सी लेवल राइज को कम करने के लिए आपने कहीं पे रिन्यूएबल एनर्जी को बढ़ा दिया, यू आर गोइंग फॉर नेट जीरो, लॉट ऑफ एक्शंस यू टेक, बट the thing is impact is still there. So you make a sea wall, that is adaptation. You make a nature based solution, that is adaptation. You capacity build, that is adaptation. So anything to do with coping with the impacts or reducing the impacts of climate change, that belongs to adaptation. The third thing is, in spite of doing everything, still there'll be a residual risk. See, residual risk, तुम सब कुछ करने के बाद भी अगर extreme precipitation हो गया, फिर भी कुछ risk तो आपके ऊपर रहेगा ही. Now, what loss and damage you incur because of the residual risk, that मतलब जो आप कितना भी adaptation कर लो, फिर भी कुछ तो risk रहेगा. उस risk की वजह से जो residual risk रह जाता है, that belongs to the category of loss and damage. So these are 3 things: mitigation, reduce GHG emissions; adaptation, prepare yourself to bear the impacts of climate change. Okay. And loss and damage means residual climate risk is what you have to do, that is loss and damage. Some things will be damaged, some things will be lost. And loss and damage, it can be loss of property, it can be loss of infrastructure, it can be loss of economy, it can have direct impact, secondary impact, tertiary impact. That goes into whatever you cannot mitigate, whatever you cannot impacts, you cannot cope up, everything goes into loss and damage. And Sharman Sheikh crop is important because there a decision was taken that for loss and damage, we will have a financial mechanism. Say suppose Fiji कहता है कि मैंने कुछ नहीं किया, the island of Fiji says I have not done anything, but climate change here is sea rise हो रहा है, or I will go underwater, I will sink, not exactly sink, the sea level rise will take me in. So how do I compensate? I have to relocate my people. Who will bear the cost? So Sharm el Sheikh COP में एक framework निकल के आया, अभी उसपे कैसे पैसा flow करेगा वो भी नहीं, but they have come up with a framework to generate finance to help people who belong to that category of loss and damage. अब अगर आपने किसी को Fiji Island अगर submerge कर गया, so you have to relocate people. Now what happens to them? It's a loss. So I'll not go more into it, but I think you've understood, okay?
Yes, thank you.
Now, the controversies, there have been, I'll just cover one huge controversy which took place with the AR4, fourth assessment report, which came out in 2007 and pertains to Indian region, because a statement was made in that AR4 that Himalayan glaciers are likely to disappear by 2035. Now, that statement was made in the IPCC report, and R.K. Pachauri at that time, who was an Indian and heading the IPCC at that time, and I think 2007 or 2008 mein IPCC ko they got Nobel Peace Prize for their work.
Yeah.
Okay? And the report came out that statement was Himalayan glaciers are likely to disappear by 2035. But the thing was, this error was discovered by an Indian glaciologist because the error was in his own work. It was a misinterpretation of his own work. He had made a statement that some smaller glaciers in Himalayas might disappear by 2035. He had not made the claim about entire Himalayan range. But his statement, see now how this statement, communication bolte na, science communication, you must have seen more, many of you would have seen that game. Corporate strategy mein bahut use hota hai on importance communication is that one person tells something to a second person, then he tells to second person. By the time it undergoes 10 or 7 iterations, end of the line you'll find the original message or last message bilkul change ho gaya. That is about simple communication. Scientific communication becomes more difficult. Now the statement is some smaller glaciers might disappear by 2035. And finally, WWF, which is the World Wildlife Federation, in their report, they made a statement that Himalayan glaciers were likely to disappear by 2035. So that is how, the understanding of a statement, or if it is, and the thing was WWF report is not a peer-reviewed scientific journal. And what IPCC did was, IPCC did not reference the original article, but reference the WWF report. So WWF report definitely said that Himalayan glaciers are likely to disappear by 2035. But just ke upar wo base tha, that work by a scientist had made a different statement. So there was a huge controversy. The controversy, it was amplified more by the Indian media. What was portrayed was that lack of scientific. How can IPCC, such a big body like IPCC, make a statement? And Indian government also made a counterattack. What are you saying? But the Indian glaciers are like, Himalayan region is like the third pole, Earth ka third pole hai. Yeah, so many tributaries. And if your Himalayan glaciers are going to sort of melt by 2035, then India, it's going to be a water crisis, all the Gangetic plains being fed, or the northern plains being fed. So it was hugely played in the media. It's a lack of credibility. IPCC. So finally, IPCC acknowledged its error. It issues a statement about the mistake. It regrets its mistake. But then the lesson learned for IPCC was, from thereafter, there was a very high degree of scrutiny. So when you do the review process, each and every statement that is made, now whether it is reference to a peer-reviewed journal or not, that is stringently checked. So the sources are basically what you quote in IPCC is not from a secondary reference. You basically track down which was the original publication which has made, and then you link it to the original peer reviewed. So it's use of non-peer reviewed. Now they don't use a non-peer reviewed resources or reports which are not non-peer reviewed. Anything which is not peer reviewed is usually not sort of taken by IPCC, and it's pooled for generating evidence. So that was a huge learning for IPCC. And it also highlighted the challenge of communicating complex scientific information to policymakers and public, because if you pick up any statement, there's high confidence of this and, error within this and this, the ranges. I remember some participant asked me yesterday when I was covering those SSP scenarios, and I said that within this SSP1, the heating is going to be, the warming is going to be from 1 to 2.5 degrees Celsius. So then somebody asked me where. So the thing is, the statement that I had made was about a global mean rise in temperature. Okay, so what is global mean? What is global mean temperature? If I ask, it's an open question. What is the global mean temperature of Earth at sea level till? If I ask you, is there anybody who can answer that question? What is the global mean temperature at mean sea level? Earth's global mean temperature. It is 15 degrees Celsius. So what is global mean? Global mean temperature at mean sea level. So the thing is, when you make scientific statements, you have to understand their complex statement. If I say, I will just deconstruct this word, global mean surface temperature at mean sea level. The first thing, it is global. So it's an average. See, somebody's mic is on. I think if you can mute it. So global means it is an average for the entire globe. Okay? Mean means mean matlab, because temperature, there are a lot of many types of temperature. You have maximum temperature, mean maximum temperature, you have highest maximum temperature, you have mean minimum temperature, you have lowest minimum temperature. So when I'm talking of mean temperature, it means it's not highest, it's not lowest, it's the mean average temperature. Then I'm talking at sea level, because you have temperature at sea level, you have temperature at 850 hectopascal. But as you go up in the atmosphere, different layers, you have different temperatures. So which temperature am I talking about? So what I'm trying to tell you is that when you communicate complex scientific information, at times that understanding on the policymaker and the public understanding on the side of the public, a general public, or somebody who doesn't come from a scientific community, the interpretation may be might different. So it is difficult for the other person to appreciate the complexity of scientific information. It becomes very difficult. If it is complex, then to make it simple becomes all the more a difficult task. So this IPCC controversy it highlighted the challenges of communicating complex scientific information to general public per se, or to policymakers also, because who sits at the policy level? If you ask Indian setup, you'll find who's the policymaker, say within a ministry, you'll find it as a secretary or an additional secretary who's an IS officer. He's an Indian Administrative Service Officer. So it's an administrative service officer who's responsible for making policy. If you're sitting in a scientific ministry, then you are making policy for a scientific ministry, but you are an administrative officer. So you're a policy maker. So what the scientist, somebody, a professor from IIT Delhi who's worked on, say, air pollution, if he has to explain the complexity of air pollution to a secretary who is responsible for making policy, he cannot use all that jargon. He'll have to deconstruct the whole thing. Tell him in a very simple term, ki itna badhega, itna kam hoga. Well, I'm just giving you an example, a very simple example. Because policymaker doesn't require ki, what was your variation here and how many degree of confidence you have and what was your range you were using. आप मुझे layman term में बताओ कि मुझे अगर pollution इतने ppm के नीचे रखना है तो मुझे क्या क्या करना पड़ेगा, sources कहाँ पर हैं, combat करने की strategy क्या है, हमारे पास क्या technology है, whether we have the resources or not. But the policy making is a different, it's an art in itself. So using the science and making the policies art itself. But the thing is, what I'm trying to highlight here is that the entire controversy, it tells you that complex scientific, when you come out of those domains and research in your scientific community and you have to make it applicable. IPCC ka yahi kaam hai. IPCC deals with hardcore science. But what is its purpose? Its purpose is to guide policy. So it has to bring out its information in a manner that it is understandable by a policymaker. That is why you have summary for policymakers. So you try to sort of make it deconstructed and make it policy relevant, which is policy relevant. Researchers, it's a gold mine. So you can go deep dive, do whatever, which field you want to. But policy, kya implications? So it is challenging. But then IPCC had to undertake in this. That is the main purpose why IPCC was constructed. Guide policy, generate scientific evidence, guide policy. So that is, I will stop it here. And what is the time we have? Okay, we have a little bit of time. So I will sum up now and then go on to this. So basically today was more of a non-technical session. So we started yesterday with IPCC, its types of report, how it is prepared, reviewed, approved, how can we as an individual or as a researcher can engage with the IPCC reports. We came up with few concepts, terminologies, primarily modeling based. And then we did a little bit of demo on how to navigate. Today, we covered the implications and the applications and what are the critics' responses and few controversies that IPCC was involved in. Now, I basically, Pratiksha asked me to add some details on how we can use this data in our field. And most of you come from ESG domain. So basically the type of reporting that you do, and depending on the type of industry that you come from, you will have to see which type of data you use, but this is the type of data that is available. So if you want to identify the potential risk, you can look into the changes in weather patterns. So go to the IPCC website, or maybe if you want to look into the text and reports, so see how the weather patterns are going to change. So how the intensity of extreme weather events is going to increase, and whether the region that you are, where your industry is based, whether that area becomes an area where the intensity is going to change, how whether it is applicable to sea level rise. But basically, what is the type of climate risk that is pertain to the geography where your industry is located in, and then how it might affect. So if it says that, the number of heat days are going to increase by this much, or the number of rainy days are going to increase by this much, so it sort of keep on increasing the relevance of the data depending on the geography that you are, and then see correlated how it affects your operation or your supply chain or your consumer or the customers that your industry caters to. Then because ESG reporting is also about sort of showcasing the efforts that you are doing to make your footprint little less. So you can identify mitigation options for GHG reductions. So the type of reporting that you do. So you have RE energy options available, energy efficiency, carbon prices, or how you make a transition to a low carbon economy, depending on which sector of the economy that you are working on. It can inform in terms of ESG reporting on the environment and the governance aspects of it. Social and the governance aspects of it. So impacts on climate change. So if you have, say, suppose impacts on human health, whether it is going to cause some displacement, how the impact is going to impact that particular geography, how it is going to affect your business. Then what are the governance structures that are required to report? So say suppose you identify certain climate risk over your region, then to combat that risk, what should be your, what type of evaluations you should be taken, whether you want, what type of technology you should, say suppose you're expanding your infrastructure, then what type of climate resilience infrastructure you should be investing in, what is the type of risk, what is the return period that you're looking for. So your mitigation and adaptation and your entire business strategy for that particular period can be guided by the climate risk that can be identified from the IPCC reports. And then its role in your designing your own policy and regulation, and that can, the data that is available, so that can be used for basically informing your ESG reporting. So this is what I have on the platter right now. I am open to questions. Any questions that you have related to the session we had yesterday, what we had today, or anything that is related to it, even if it goes beyond, I'll make an attempt to answer if I know a bit about it. So we have a little bit of time. We are about 8:22 now. So it's open. I'll stop sharing my slides now and switch on your cameras if you have the bandwidth to do it. And I'm open to questions.
Hi, I have a question with respect to NDCs. All the countries sort of making a commitment that they want to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. So that reduction is based on the production basis, or is it based on the consumption basis? What I understand is currently, unfortunately, it's all based on production basis, not the consumption. That's how the developed countries are sort of escaping from the commitments.
Yeah, it is production based. And the NDC, I'll sort of start with the GHG inventory, and then I'll come on to the NDC. So when you prepare your GHG inventory, because the NDCC, if you look at the architecture, you have a UNFCCC, which is called the Rio Agreement. Under that, the IPCC methodology informs how so under UNFCCC, you have a certain reporting mechanism. So every country has to report in a particular manner. It is called national communications, and different reporting obligations for developed country parties and developed. So there's a divide there. So the type of information and the frequency at which you report and how stringent that information needs to be, that is little lenient for the developing country parties. Now, how are you going to prepare your inventory? Because you're supposed to report on your inventory also. That inventory reporting, how it is to be prepared, is looked after by IPCC. The methodology is provided by IPCC. Now, the IPCC methodology is basically production-based. It is not consumption-based. So there's a huge debate. In fact, there's a good paper by my former colleague, Himangna Gupta. If you look at it, look for a paper on production versus consumption emissions. But what Europe is going to do right now is they have come up with that legislation on carbon leakage. So, how you...
Ma'am, what do you mean by production consumption?
Okay. Okay. Again, I have to give you an example. Just to make you understand, to give you an example, say suppose I tell you that if you go to Europe, you'll find that the emissions are basically most of the European countries or Western countries, they've already peaked. Their emissions have peaked. They are basically now their emission trajectory is reducing. Matlab, they have reached a particular level. Now their emissions, if you monitor their inventory, you'll find every year their emissions are going down, and they've made certain committed 2030, 2050. You go to India, you come to India, you go to Vietnam, you go to Bangladesh, their emissions are still on the rise. Reason is now these countries, especially Europe is very proactive in terms of climate legislations. They have, under the Kyoto Protocol arrangements that came up, Kyoto Protocol came after the UNFCCC, and Kyoto Protocol basically is a protocol under which the developed country parties, jitna Western world hai, they were given commitments that 1995 levels ke what was your baseline emissions in 1995? You reduce 5% from that up till your first commitment period. They had a first commitment period to 2012, if I'm not wrong. And every country which was a party to Kyoto Protocol had to reduce their emissions 5% from the 1995 baseline level, GHG inventory. Okay. So then they had a carbon market coming in because of trade of emissions, because some are able to meet their market, some are not able to. So what they did is, because their measures are very stringent, what they did is they basically shifted all their industry primarily to the global south. So you have major production taking place in India, in Vietnam, in Bangladesh, in global south. So what will happen? Something is being produced in India. The entire pollution takes place in India, and what Europe does it purchases the ready-made product. So just to give an example of a Coke bottle or a biscuit or a apparel. So everything, the dyeing, the stitching, everything is done in India. So all the related emissions, pollution, water, everything used in India, the clean product is exported to Europe. It purchases it and it gets a clean product. So this is called, so the production emissions take place in India, or for that matter in the global south, because of the availability of cheap labor and less stringent environmental laws, but the clean product is used in Europe. But if you find that for making that product, how much emissions were globally, see the emissions finally have gone into the earth per se, hamare atmosphere, hamare ocean mein gaye sare emissions. So globally, if you see, for producing a bar of chocolate, or for producing a shirt, or for producing anything, a particular product, what was the emissions that were involved in production of this item? And you find that it is a very emission intensive product. बहुत productions emissions निकले हैं, लेकिन वो emissions count, they were, all those emissions are counted in the GHG inventory of India or Bangladesh or Vietnam. And Americas and USA's, America का बड़ा emitter है, but Europe का inventory is clean. But who's using that product? That those products. So emissions are basically calculated in terms of production and consumption. So if you find the emissions associated with a product, and you account those emissions in the country which is consuming the product, if you calculate that way, you'll find that India, all the countries which are now producing more but are not consuming it. You find a factory in Bangladesh where a small person 10 rupees make shirt sil raha hai per shirt, and that shirt under a van use and label is sold into so many hundreds of dollars in US. He's not getting that share, but the share of emissions is going into who's consuming it. US or Europe is consuming it, but the emissions go into the inventory of us. That is how India and all those countries which are now polluting have the share of emissions. They're all production emissions. They're not consumption emissions. So that is the difference. I hope I've
Got it, ma'am. Thanks.
So what was the question earlier was on emissions. Okay. So the thing is, when you make those NDC commitments, first thing is your NDC commitments are made against your own inventory, and your inventory is calculated on production emissions. So, and when you see how much is the, it's a voluntary target, but what you make under NDC, you're supposed to sort of be ambitious, revise it upwards every 5 years. But the thing is, the entire methodology is production based. It is not consumption based.
Ma'am, I have a follow-up question on the same. At the corporate level, what we do is we do at a scope level 1 emission, scope 2 and scope 3. So the one we're talking about mostly falls under scope 3, right? Why can't it be done in a similar fashion, even at the country level?
Now see, because I've been involved with the process of inventory preparation, so I'll tell you how difficult it is to get data. So when you prepare, I'll tell you how the IPCC methodology for GHG inventory goes now. So they have some set of guidelines. Let me not go into the details of guidelines, but what they say is we have 3 types of methodologies: tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 for preparation of GHG inventory. So if you use tier 1, so what IPCC has done is IPCC has given you a template where they have for every product, there are 5 sectors. So you have energy, you have industrial production and product use, then you have agriculture, then you have waste, and you have land use and land use change in forestry. So 5 sectors. For every sectors, they have subsectors, activities they're given you. Now, how do you calculate emission? Say, suppose, just to give you an example, agar energy mein one component is coal. So I'll say India use, say, suppose 10,000 tons of coals, just for the sake of example. And 1 kilogram of coal emits this much emissions. So if I use 10,000 tons of coal, so what I do is 10,000 and tons se 1,000 se multiply it by the emission factor, and I get itna CO2 emit hoga. That's the most basic methodology. Now, what matters is what is the emission factor you're using. Quite probably, coal all over the world is very different. Within India, you have some 11 and 12 varieties of coal. Everything, kisi mein sulfur content zyada hai, uska emission factor utna hai ki nahi hai. So if you use the default values that IPCC has given you, you are using tier 1 methodology, emission factors, as well as the activity data. Activity data matlab kitna coal use kiya. If you're not using the IPCC default values and you're not using aggregated data at national level, you go into disaggregated data and you use sector specific emission factor. Emission factor bhi kya hota? Because there's research going on. India's got a lot of CSR labs, and there are those labs, they undertake a lot of experiments, and they say, okay, agar ye wali coal variety hai, we have done so much of experiments, and this is the emission factor. They get it published in a peer-reviewed journal. So a rigorous scientific process. They said, okay, ye emission factor hai, and we say, okay, theek hai, ye scientific literature peer-reviewed. It has to be a peer-reviewed journal, and we are revising our emission factor. So we have a disaggregate data, and we are assigning uspe specific emission factor. So we go on to tier 2 methodology. Tier 3 methodology is basically where you build your inventory from bottom up. Say, suppose I give you an example of Delhi. So Delhi may all these sources, I map all the sources. So you have mobile sources, transport mein, non-mobile sources. You have formal sector, you have informal sector. Now imagine it is so difficult to have that granularity of data and to build an inventory from bottom up where you use a tier. Most accurate one is tier 3 methodology, where aapko pata hai sare sources pata hai, उन सब sources से specific emission factors पता है. So it's a tier 3 methodology for all the sectors. So as of now, if you have a look at I will be able to show you a graph. Just wait. I'll show you a graph from our GG inventory workshop, just to tell you कि हम कहाँ पे we have time. Na? Just wait for a second. I'll share my screen. Okay. Let me just open it, and then I'll just give you an idea कि हमारी inventory में कितना granularity है. Maximum we are operating at tier 1. Just hold on for a second. I'll share a presentation with you.
Yeah.
Few slides. Have I stopped sharing my screen, or am I sharing my screen?
No, you have
I stopped sharing, na?
sharing.
Let me just see here. My presentation. Just 1 second. Na? I think I have time. Just let me open, because it is always easier to show you a data and then talk about it. Then
Yes. Abha, I have put some question and MCQ kind of answers, but I am not able to figure out what is the answer. So it would help everybody to understand this question as well. I have put it in the chat. So later discuss this, because I'm really confused on that.
where is the chat? Let me show this slide on.
Bilkul.
So then I'll sort of lose track on this, which is this architecture. Okay, so you're able to see my screen now? Okay, so if you look at this, so if you look at This is the methodology. This is the tier methodology that we're using for energy. There are various activities, and you see, we have, this is for CO2 emissions, carbon dioxide, because you calculate various type of emissions, and then you change, sort of calculate, convert them into equivalent CO2 emissions multiplied by its global, there's a kitna warming factor hai, GWP value hoti hai, usse multiply karke everything is equated to CO2 level. So you find, say, energy may, it is only in 2 subsectors that we have been able to use tier 3 methodology. Otherwise, it is usually tier 1 or tier 2. Okay, I'll show you other sectors also. This is your industrial processes and product use. You'll find there is no tier 3 methodology. So mineral, chemical, supply T1 and T2 hai. But because we're using the default emission factor that IPCC had. Now go to agriculture. Agriculture may we are using tier 1 and tier 2 methodology, methane and nitrous oxide. So why reason is because we don't have data. Land use and land use change in forestry में we are using tier 2 methodology. हमारे पास है ही नहीं डेटा उसको करने के लिए. Waste के लिए you'll find we have gone T2, बल्कि waste water के लिए we've been working with NEERI as a lab for अब NEERI का full form मुझे ध्यान में नहीं आ रहा है, but I think for it's Nagpur में there's a lab, CSR lab called NEERI, so they do the wastewater handling for us, and the entire waste sector का inventory is run by them. They've been doing it for very long. Very dedicated research lab, but here also we are still on tier 2 methodology. So we don't have data to go for tier 3. So ideally speaking, it should be higher granularity of data, but then to amount of resource that you need to have that granularity of data. That is why we are still on tier 2 or tier 1. Very few sectors we have been able to graduate into tier 3 methodology.
And also, ma'am, these factors, the one you mentioned, global warming potential, right? That's the one. Are they static one or they keep changing?
See, so IPCC comes up with the values of GWP, and GWP values have, depending on the peer review scientific literature, only अगर कहीं पे GWP value change होगी तो होगी. Otherwise, the standard values which are published in assessment 5 in assessment reports of IPCC, and when a country uses a particular GWP value, it gives a reference. Like I think BOR3 में we have used AR5 की revised GWP values. But उसमें भी थोड़ा वो है कि there's a little bit of flexibility in terms of which GWP values you can use, because some GWP values in AR5 were little revised. They were enhanced basically. And developing country parties को नहीं use करना था, मतलब they were encouraged basically. So it was not mandatory for them. So GWP values. So to answer your questions, GWP values are revised at times, revised by IPCC and published in their assessment reports, and then they act for us. They act as a sort of reference where to pick.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, now Pratiksha, what were you asking? Chat में डाला है क्या कहीं पे?
हाँ. तो बेसिकली क्वेश्चन, मुझे गलत आंसर वहां पे भी गलत आंसर दिखा रहा है जहाँ मैं ये एग्जाम देने जा रही थी.
कौन सा क्वेश्चन है ये? Understand T1, T2, do you know to know?
Is this the ऊपर in response to policy technology बोला.
Okay, in response to policy and technology changes, cement manufacturer looks for a new opportunity to raise profits by reducing GHG. Because of the cement industry accounts for considerable population, the manufacturer joins a coalition of company pairs. Lobbies to adhere to the Paris Agreement. In which of the following actions does the coalition recommend? Align the first round of NDC with a 2-degree warming limit, followed by a second round of 1.5 degree. Set 2020 as a smaller scale to comply with the ratchet up mechanism. Is this your answer?
No, these are MCQs. I mean, I like only one, but they are showing the C as an answer, but मुझे नहीं पता, मतलब how are we coming on to this conclusion?
Asha, see, now there are two things. You should, but there's a lot of jargon that is used here, so I will just try to deconstruct it with you. When you do a NDC, see, इसमें पहला option क्या दिया? NDC 2-degree warming. Second, it says set NDC smaller to with the ratchet mechanism. Then it says NDC, then COP. Then it says NDC targets and review. So the kahani is that under the UNFCCC, you have a COP which meets every year. Okay? So, but under the Paris Agreement, from where the NDC has come up, you are supposed to revise your NDC every 5 years. तो तुमको ये पता होना चाहिए दे आर नेशनली डिटर्मिन्ड कॉन्ट्रीब्यूशन. नेशनली डिटर्मिन्ड मतलब क्योटो प्रोटोकॉल में क्या हुआ था, इट वाज डिसाइड द टॉप कि आपकी बेसलाइन 1995 से यू रिड्यूस 5%. सो इट वाज अ टॉप डाउन मैकेनिज्म, जिसका जितना है एवरीबॉडी विल रिड्यूस 5%. नो क्वेश्चंस, नो फ्लेक्सिबिलिटी. एनडीसी में क्या है, नेशन हैज डिसाइडेड नेशनली डिटर्मिन्ड कॉन्ट्रीब्यूशन. हमने डिटर्मिन किया है कि हम क्या, हमने टारगेट नहीं दिया कॉन्ट्रीब्यूशन, हम क्या कॉन्ट्रीब्यूट करेंगे टू द ग्लोबल क्लाइमेट एक्शन. सो इंडिया डिसाइड फॉर इटसेल्फ. Now they said that every 5 years आप अपने NDCs को रिवाइज करो and you ratchet it up. Ratchet क्या होता है, जब आप टाइट करते हो ना किसी स्क्रू को तो टाइट हो जाता है. तो ratcheting up is basically tightening this. So basically increase your climate ambition. आप सपोज अगर हमने पहले कहा था कि हम अपने उसमें इतना गीगावाट शेयर ऑफ सोलर या नॉन फॉसिल रखेंगे, तो नेक्स्ट ईयर हम अपने टारगेट को कम नहीं कर सकते. यू आर सपोज टू मेक एनहांस योर एम्बिशन. Enhancing your ambition is basically the ratcheting up mechanism that they're talking about. थर्ड थिंग इज एनडीसी पे जब आप रिपोर्ट करोगे, यू रिपोर्ट विद एवरी बाइनल अपडेट. जो आपकी पेरिस एग्रीमेंट के नीचे हमारा एक नया मैकेनिज्म आ रहा है, एनहांस ट्रांसपेरेंसी फ्रेमवर्क. सो व्हेन यू सबमिट अ बाइनल ट्रांसपेरेंसी रिपोर्ट, उस ट्रांसपेरेंसी रिपोर्ट में वो एनडीसी के ऊपर प्रोग्रेस को रिपोर्ट किया जाएगा. ठीक है. सो अब इसका बेसिक क्वेश्चन ये है कि इफ यू आर अ सीमेंट इंडस्ट्री एंड आपको ग्लोबल एमिशन में बहुत ज्यादा कर रहे हो और आप लॉबी कर रहे हो पेरिस एग्रीमेंट के लिए अपनी कंट्री गवर्नमेंट से, एंड सीमेंट का मेजर शेयर है, तो आप क्या करोगे, व्हाट आर द फॉलोइंग एक्शंस डज द कोलिशन, ये कोलिशन किसका है, कोलिशन ऑफ द कोलिशन ऑफ सीमेंट इंडस्ट्रीज. तो उनका रिकमेंडेशन क्या होगा, क्या रिकमेंडेशन होगा नेशनल गवर्नमेंट से. सपोज इंडियन का जो सीमेंट कोलैबोरेशन इंडस्ट्रीज का है, वो गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया को क्या रिकमेंडेशन देगा. उनका बेसिक ऑब्जेक्टिव क्या है कि आपको कोल के एमिशंस को कम करना है. So first thing is align the first round with 2 degree warming followed by the second round 1. No, this will not be applicable. Why? Because जब हम एनडीसी में इंडिया का क्या कमिटमेंट है, इंडिया आपका वो उसको वही रिकमेंडेशन देगा जो इंडिया के एनडीसी से अलाइंड होगा, है ना. इंडिया के एनडीसीज में कहीं पे 2 डिग्री 1 डिग्री की बात नहीं होती. There are 8 NDCs that India has submitted. इंडिया हैज नॉट मेड एनी कमिटमेंट कि हम इतना एमिशन रिडक्शन करेंगे, हमारे इतना टेम्परेचर का जीएजी एमिशंस का कोई कमिटमेंट नहीं है. जो हमारी क्वांटिफाइड एमिशन, इसमें से 8 में से आई थिंक 3 हमारे या 4 हमारे क्वांटिफाइड एमिशन. क्वांटिफाइड मतलब जहां हमने नंबर्स की बात करी है. पहला हमने कहा है कि हमारा शेयर ऑफ रिन्यूएबल एनर्जी वुड बी नॉन फॉसिल फ्यूल से वुड बी, पहले कम किया था, अब हमने शायद आई थिंक 2030 में इंक्रीज करके 500 गीगावाट्स कर दिया है. नॉन फॉसिल फ्यूल, नॉन फॉसिल फ्यूल मतलब रिन्यूएबल भी हो सकता है, न्यूक्लियर भी हो सकता है. ठीक है. सेकेंड थिंग वी हैव सेड, emission intensity of GDP will increase it now to 45%. Third, we've said कि will increase the carbon sink by afforestation method. यही हमारे बस 3 कमिटमेंट है क्वांटिफाइड, जहां नंबर्स की बात करें. बाकी हम कह रहे हैं अडेप्टेशन को बढ़ाएंगे, क्लाइमेट फ्रेंडली लाइफस्टाइल लेके आएंगे, टेक्नोलॉजी ट्रांसफर वो सब बढ़ाएंगे, प्रोवाइडेड वी गेट द सपोर्ट, फाइनेंशियल सपोर्ट. तो तुम्हारा पहला वाला चला गया. Second wala set 1922 NDC at a smaller scale to this also goes because we're not talking about ratcheting mechanism hai hi nahi.
Ratcheting mechanism happens every 5 years, right? It's a similar to what
when you revise your NDC, you enhance your ambition, you ratchet it up.
Yeah.
Okay. So next is also saying that tighten NDCs, so ratchet also tighten, right?
नहीं, देखो क्या है इसमें, क्या इसने बोला यहाँ पे पीरियड क्या बोल रहा है, 2019 to 2022. जो एनडीसी हमने फर्स्ट एनडीसी कब दिया, 2015. सेकंड एनडीसी कब देंगे. सी यू हैव टू लुक एट द टाइमलाइंस आल्सो ना. सो यू गिव योर एनडीसी एवरी 5 years. सो नेक्स्ट एनडीसी हमें 2020 में देना था. एवरीबडी हैड टू सबमिट इन 2020, बट कोरोना हिट कर गया, सो वो डिले हो गया. सो पीपल हैव स्टार्टेड सबमिटिंग बाय 2021 2022. इंडिया सबमिटेड अ रिवाइज्ड एनडीसी इन 2022. जहां हमने रैचेट अप क्या किया है, सिर्फ अपना जहां हमने नॉन फॉसिल फ्यूल ऑफ एनर्जी किया था वो रैचेट अप किया है, वी सेड 500 गीगावाट्स. एंड जहां हम बात कर रहे थे एनर्जी एफिशिएंसी ऑफ जीडीपी, दैट वी रैचेटेड अप फ्रॉम 30 to 35%, वी नाउ इंक्रीज्ड इट टू 45%. दो जगह.
ये ऑयल एंड जो हार्ड टू अबेट सेक्टर है, उनको कुछ टारगेट दे के रखा है क्या, आप इतना ही इमिट कर सकते हो वो कार्बन टैक्स के वजह से, मतलब
टारगेट नहीं, टारगेट तो नहीं दिया है, पर कार्बन टैक्स, अब जैसे हमारे में क्या हो रहा है, कार्बन टैक्सेशन की बात भी हो रही है और कार्बन मार्केट की बात भी, डोमेस्टिक कार्बन मार्केट की बात है. सो दे हैव एज ऑफ नाउ, एज फार एज आई एम अवेयर, दे नॉट गिवन देम टारगेट्स. दे माइट हैव सॉर्ट ऑफ कार्बन टैक्सेस में उसको ऐड कर देंगे, अ टैक्स कंपोनेंट वुड बी देयर इफ इट गोज बियॉन्ड दिस एंड दिस इज योर how your slabs are going to change, and how much carbon tax you're supposed to give. But I think in terms of emission targets, I don't think there's a. I'm not aware of it. If it is
Yes,
there, I'm not.
even I'm not. I just read somewhere because other countries, they are rapidly making policies on carbon tax, but India won't have the carbon tax policy. I thought that our NDC gives some industry specific standard, like this much you can.
No. There are no, let me make it very clear, and I'm absolutely clear on this. Government of India has not given any emission reduction target to any industry, any sector. No. हम लोग एनर्जी एफिशिएंसी की बात करते हैं. सो देयर इज अ ब्यूरो ऑफ एनर्जी एफिशिएंसी व्हिच टॉक्स अबाउट द स्कीम एमिशन एफिशिएंसी को बढ़ाने के लिए. दे आर गिवन देम सम टारगेट्स इन टर्म्स ऑफ देयर रिन्यूएबल एनर्जी टारगेट्स. कि अगर आप अपनी एनर्जी एफिशिएंसी को बढ़ाओगे और आपके पास इतना, आप यू आर गिविंग बैक टू द ग्रिड और समथिंग, और आपने आपके शेयर ऑफ एनर्जी में रिन्यूएबल एनर्जी का मिक्स है, सो यू गेट इशूड सम रिन्यूएबल एनर्जी सर्टिफिकेट्स व्हिच यू कैन सेल इन द कार्बन मार्केट. सो वो हमारा जब बीई की फर्स्ट पैट साइकिल चली थी, तब से कार्बन मार्केट में हम यूज कर रहे थे उसको. अब क्या हो रहा है हमारे डोमेस्टिक, बिकॉज विद एनडीसी व्हाट हैज हैपेंड इज सबने टारगेट्स ले लिए. एंड पेरिस एग्रीमेंट का लॉन्ग टर्म गोल क्या है कि 2 डिग्री सेल्सियस से ज्यादा वार्मिंग नहीं रखनी है 2100 में. और अगर बहुत लॉन्ग टर्म गोल है तो आप उसको 1.5 के लिए एस्पायर करो. अभी एक्सप्लिसिट नहीं बोल रहा है, दे सेड ओके एंड ट्राई टू एस्पायर टू 1.5 डिग्रीज. तो 2 डिग्रीज तो होने ही होने चाहिए, 1.5 किलो तो बहुत बढ़िया है. तो उसकी वजह से नाउ मोस्ट ऑफ द कंट्रीज, कुछ क्योटो प्रोटोकॉल के सेकंड फेज में जो उनका टारगेट था, विद नाउ न्यू स्कीम्स कमिंग अप इन इंटरनेशनल एविएशन लाइक कोसिया, तो उन्होंने क्या किया, इंटरनेशनल एविएशन ने अपने ऊपर टारगेट ले लिया दैट विल गो कार्बन न्यूट्रल बाय 2020. यानी कि जितना भी स्टेट था, फिर उन्होंने बाद में अपनी बेसलाइन को रिवाइज किया 2019, बिकॉज 2020 में बिकॉज ऑफ कोरोना एविएशन ही स्टॉप हो गया, तो उनका बेसलाइन तो बहुत लो सेट है. तो वो कहानी है. सो कहानी है कि इफ यू हैव सेड वी गो कार्बन न्यूट्रल, नाउ मोस्ट ऑफ द कंट्रीज आर टेकिंग अ नेट जीरो गोल. So if you go carbon neutral, how do you go carbon neutral? Either you stop emitting or you compensate for whatever emissions you go beyond your net zero target. So the carbon market is going to come up again now. It is coming up. So India में भी क्या हो रहा है, एक domestic carbon market की बात हो रही है अभी. So it is still in the planning stage. It is going to come very soon.
Correct.
So तो वो domestic carbon. So इस केस में क्या होगा? Let me just finish this one. So if now the third one, now third says tighten NDC, report NDC progress every 5 years. So you report every NDC. So by the process of elimination, I'm telling you, one goes because it doesn't meet, 2 goes because NDC के लिए period fit नहीं करता है, third one stays, revise NDC targets annually. Now Paris Agreement doesn't demand annually and submit for review. So D also goes. So your answer basically becomes your answer C.
Okay, got it.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any other question?
Ma'am, you mentioned about carbon markets. What are these things?
See, carbon markets में क्या होता है? Okay, let me give you an example. Say, suppose a hypothetical example. I'm giving you a hypothetical example because I don't have any concrete example in this now. Say, suppose India says I'll go carbon zero by net zero by 2070. Or say, suppose let me give you Europe का example. Under the Kyoto Protocol, because carbon market वहीं से evolve हुआ था basically. Under Kyoto Protocol, every developed country party was given a goal कि 1995 baseline के you have to make 5% reduction. So now how do you make your reduction? So what they said कि okay, let us make a marketplace in which, say suppose 5% reduction करना, तो किसी country ने 2% reduction किया, किसी country ने 10% reduction किया. So what they say is that if you have made reductions which are more than what you're supposed to do, so जो आपने अगर 10% कर लिया, तो आपके पास जो extra 5% जो आपने ज़्यादा कर लिया है, वो you can sell it in a carbon market, and the country which has not been able to achieve its target, it will be able to buy. तो क्योंकि होना क्या है, एमिशंस तो क्यूमुलेटिवली कम होने हैं ना ग्लोब में. अगर हम कहेंगे कि इंडिया इतना कम कर देगा एंड चाइना उतना बढ़ा सकता है ज्यादा, तो बैलेंस में नेट में क्या हुआ, नेट when we talk of, we don't say we will go, we say net zero. Net zero मतलब if I have exceeded a limit somewhere here, I will take up an activity where the GHG emissions are getting reduced. तो आप कार्बन सिंक जनरेट कर दोगे उसका. So now if somebody has generated a sink, यानी उन्होंने जितने टारगेट से उतना ज्यादा रिड्यूस कर लिया, और किसी को वो जितने टारगेट से उसको नहीं मीट कर पा रहा, तो वो क्या करेगा, वो they'll give some money, and in terms of money उनके credits exchange हो जाएंगे. So when you trade these carbon credits, that market is called carbon market.
Oh, ma'am, this is done on an annual basis or something like that?
नहीं, UNFCCC में go, there's a CDM का portal, they have a component on CDM, Clean Development Mechanism. So when the Kyoto Protocol came out, Kyoto Protocol has two mechanisms for carbon markets. One was called joint implementation and the other one was called CDM, Clean Development Mechanism. So joint implementation basically was within developed country parties. उनके आपस के बीच की थी, कोई कोलैबोरेट कर सकते हैं आपस में. एंड क्लीन डेवलपमेंट मैकेनिज्म सेट किसी सपोज इंडिया में एक एफोरेस्टेशन का प्रोजेक्ट एक्स्ट्रा हो गया, हमने बहुत सारे पेड़ लगा दिए, कैलकुलेट किया कि इतना बड़ा प्लांटेशन करने के बाद वी कुड रिड्यूस और क्रिएट अ सिंक जिसमें इतने एमिशंस रिड्यूस हो गए. सो व्हाट कैन हैपन इज दैट say some country, say suppose Germany or any country in Europe decides कि अगर मुझे इतने emissions कम करने, तो वो क्या करेगा, जिस भी एस्टैब्लिशमेंट ने इसको कम किया है, emissions को इंडिया में कम किया है एफोरेस्टेशन से, वो UNFCCC में एक CDM की रजिस्ट्री होती है. CDM मतलब क्लीन डेवलपमेंट की रजिस्ट्री होती है. सो यहाँ जो इंडिया में जिसने किया है वो किसी वेरीफाई मैकेनिज्म टू वेरीफाई कि हुआ कि नहीं हुआ, वो उस रजिस्ट्री में कहेगा कि मेरे पास इतने क्रेडिट्स हैं बेचने के लिए, एंड the country, say suppose Italy or Germany, whichever country, will say, okay, I want to buy these many credits. So the entire market takes place through a registry, which is basically coordinated by UNFCCC. जो ये framework agreement on climate change है, you go into the website, look for CDM. CDM का पूरा एक portal है registry का. And फिर वो बहुत बड़ा, अब तो carbon market पे internationally बहुत बड़ा हुआ, फिर बाद में crash कर गया, and there's a lot of kahani. Carbon market is again a very big, I don't know too much about it. I can give you sort of broad idea about how carbon markets work, but it's like you generate carbon credits by undertaking activities which act as a sink, जहाँ पे कि आपके emissions absorb हो रहे होते हैं या emissions reduce हो रहे होते हैं. So they generate carbon credits and they sell it in the carbon market, and whosoever needs to reduce his emission will purchase. So it's like an accounting measure. Okay.
Okay.
Okay, any more questions?
Okay,
we still have a little bit of time.
Yeah, we have
5-10 minutes more maybe. So if you have any questions, we can have those, and in case you don't have questions and somebody wants to present, so we can have presentations also.
Ma'am, I need some guidance from you, ma'am. So for what I've seen or observed is this IAM model sort of provides a projection for these natural calamities. But from a financial institution point of view, how can we convert these projections into financial impacts? I mean, who actually does it? Who are the modelers? Are they different from the traditional economic modelers? Or are there any specific, very niche skills needed in order to convert those into financial impacts?
Yeah, see, I will sort of add on to minor correction I'd like to make. You said that IM is used to make projections. IM is not made to make projections. IAM is used to make scenarios. Projections are made by climate models. So you can have a RCM or a GCM. Just for the sake of other audience also. Now I have a few slides, but if I go back to it, they are little complicated. So I'll not use the slides now. But in climate modeling, what happens is that you have how climate models work is the climate models, they work at GCM level, global level. So they are called global climate models. They also work at smaller levels, regional levels, which are called the regional climate models. Now, within the climate model, you feed a scenario. Scenario we've seen yesterday and today, not today, yesterday we see what are scenarios. So the scenarios are generated by integrated assessment models or IAMs. So the various variables, and finally everything is put in as a numerical input. So IAM will generate a scenario, and that scenario will be fed into a RCM, yeah, that is a regional climate model or a global climate model. And then a RCM or a GCM will generate a projection. So that is a minor correction I want to make. So from now, once a projection has come, from that projection, how to actually, because that projection will give you a range of impacts. Projection will not give you, as you have otherwise models also where you can work out, unko local area models bolte hain, if you just sort of increase from global, you come down to regional, and from regional models, you can also run your local assessment models, LAN bolte hain jinko. So they require very high degree of granularity in terms of data, and there's some models which work on finances also, to how to work out उस impact को फिर आप पर उसके लिए customize programming is done. So I'm not too much aware of it, but I am aware that it is done at local levels. Say suppose impact ko, how do you want to translate that impact in terms of so there are a few models available, but they are done at local level. So I am basically not aware of any contact currently. Otherwise I would have forwarded the contact, maybe you could have connected to that person. I know somebody in my network who does resilience planning for basically infrastructure planning for industry. Say suppose you are one industry which is into say cement manufacturing industry, and climate impact is going to impact your operations, your industrial operations on ground. So that's some sort of downscaling they do, and they do it at a resolution of 1 kilometer. I think it's even higher than 1 kilometer. I think few hundreds of meters pe bhi shayad karte hain wo. So what will be the degree of inundation, and then they link it to how it is going to impact the supply chain. So if you want, you send me a message on link. Usse mujhe yaad aa, or maybe I can Pratiksha, you can share my email ID with the participants. So if you have, you can post your particular queries, and if I have somebody in my network, I can give you the contact and sort of help you touch base with that person. And then you can sort of take it forward from there. So there are a few people who do it at a very higher resolution level. Done. I'm not aware of it, to be honest, but I think it is done. So jisko main janti hu, uske details I can give you.
That would be great, ma'am. Thank you.
ठीक है. Anybody, Ketki, Amina, Tejas, have any questions? Did you like the session? Did you learn something? Nobody wants to talk.
It's a little late also, but koi baat nahi.
No, ma'am, I just have one last question. So in terms of this, I know all these working group 1, 2, I think you have provided a very great overview of this. I have previously kind of tried to read these reports, but because of lack of understanding and how these things are bifurcated and where to find what, I have always kind of given up on this. So now probably I will dive probably deeper into these aspects and get some understanding. But if like a whole, this climate science in terms of if we want to kind of use this in our daily lives, for example, and whatever different fields we are, is there like any what do you say in terms of courses or anything that's available out there for us to get more aware so that we can kind of use this in our different fields of works surrounding ESG or built environment or anything like that?
Yes, there are a lot of MOOC platforms available, and with certification, without certification. So if you want to understand that, the most difficult part to understand in climate, in IPCC reports is basically the modeling parts. And chahe wo mitigation or chahe adaptation, everything is based on your climate projections. And know how to interpret that and so mitigation and adaptation. See, it will also depend on which subdomain you want to understand. Because IPCC आप देखोगे तो 3 verticals हैं, and उस vertical में which vertical are you interested in? So there are a lot of universities also. So go to platforms like Coursera or Unacademy, and there are a lot of courses. Some are paid, some are free. So if you want to learn on mitigation, on sustainability, on understanding, modeling, or how to do modeling yourself. So the duration varies. So on the MOOC platforms, a lot of courses are available. Some of them are like, if you honestly ask me what we've covered in these 2 days is just an overview. It's just an overview. Because IPCC otherwise is very complicated. But at least if you get so intimidated initially, and it is so technically strong, you get so entangled. What are they talking about? You not wrap your head around it. So it is just to give you an overview. Isko navigate kaise karna. Your terms over there, basically, if you understand the basic vocabulary in which they're talking, then it becomes easier for you to understand the conversation or the narrative that is being described there. But otherwise, you want to learn it. There are a lot of courses available on MOOC platforms. So वो certified भी होते हैं, non-certified भी होते हैं, paid भी होते हैं, unpaid भी होते हैं. You have to browse a bit. Coursera is one, when Unacademy is one. Otherwise, with Corona coming up, there are a lot of institutions like Harvard and Oxford and MIT, which are also offering courses. So explore that. With post Corona, this online this thing and outreach of educational institutions it has increased many-fold. So you can browse that. It's available if you want to learn. And it's very interesting.
Yeah,
Okay.
Cambridge University is offering, but you have to
Yes.
pay in euros.
वही है कि when you the entire Ivy League they demand in terms of tens of thousands of dollars, but exactly 10,000, but they'll ask $400, 600 euros, which actually turns out to be quite a bit. But not necessarily that you need an Oxford or a MIT. This thing Coursera में बहुत सारे हैं. In fact, sustainability, if you want to broadly understand, I'm forgetting the name of the professor who basically came up with this concept of नाम भूल गई अभी पता नहीं.
Long-termism, it talks about only long-term, the entire ESG.
तो उसमें बहुत सारा चीजें हैं. And जैसे अभी I found that the major mix in this particular session that we had, they come, most of you are working in the ESG domain. So आप लोगों का जो focus रहता है वो industry specific and how to do it. So इसके ऊपर भी काफी सारे courses हैं. Pratisha is a much better person to guide you on ESG. I can sort of, whatever I know about climate science and policy, I can help you on that.
Yeah, there are courses. I can send it to you if you want. I have searched a lot of courses on climate modeling. I'm doing one as well. And with Abha, we are trying to take a lot of people from government and trying to build in the next few months climate modeling, supposedly. Not going to give a promise. But yeah, can you please open your on your camera, because this is the last session with Abha ma'am. So want to take a picture and want to see your faces at night.
And I'll be honest about one thing. I got a lot of LinkedIn requests, and I have not been, because I'm a little old school. So until unless I know somebody, so just drop in a hi, and you can say that you were a part of the boot camp. So I will sort of go ahead with accepting because I really don't know. At times you get, I'm not somebody who connects very.
Yeah.
I should not use the word easily, but I don't connect very frequently. So if you've been a part of this workshop, so just drop me a message that you were in the workshop, and I sort of process the request. Okay.
We'll do that, ma'am.
Great. So can Shivangi, do you want to come online? Ki Amina. Otherwise, just give me heads up. I'll click the picture. Amina and Shivangi are in a very initial stage of this career. They just passed out environmental science and they are trying to come into the industry. So I'm guiding them through this bootcamp. So let's take a picture if you all are ready. Thank you so much. Please smile. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Charu. Thank you, Arun, Vinay, Melvin, Ketki. Hope to know more details about you, and in future boot camps also I would like to help you guys. And if you have any question for Abha, do CC me. I'm sending her email ID and details, and Abha will reach out if they have any prominent question on case study, because they need to submit a case study. Before that, I'm not gonna give them certificate because I want to know that they understand whatever we had in 2 days. And thank you so much, Abha, for spending time with us.
And thank you. Thank you. It was an interesting audience.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you all. Bye.
Bye.